Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this session on negotiating with non-tribal entities. My name is Pablo Padilla Jr. I've been an attorney going on my 20th year now, and I have to contain my excitement. I was recently given the job of a lifetime to represent the Zuni tribe. That's where I'm from in New Mexico. I was just recently appointed to be special legal counsel for that tribe, and I'm really happy about it because it's been 18, 19 years of practicing law, and I actually finally get to do this for my own community, which I'm really excited about. Just a little bit about me. I got my undergraduate degree from Harvard College in the late 90s. I went to law school at the University of New Mexico, got my law degree there in 2005. And spent 4 years in private practice, and then the rest of the years practicing as general legal counsel for various tribes. And what I'd really like to do this afternoon, I'm glad you all attended, it's going to be fun. I've put together for you all some short case studies that I've experienced as being an attorney, and I'd like to share them with you as experiences that I think there's some lessons that we all can learn from. How I'd like to begin this afternoon is just a little bit about where I come from. I'm from the Pueblo of Zuni, and we started out in the Grand Canyon. That's how my old people say. We actually came out of the Grand Canyon, and then we migrated to present-day western New Mexico. My village is famous because in 1540, when the Spanish came to this part of the country, our village was the first village in what's now present-day Southwest United States that was visited by that group. In 1680, there was a series of revolts by my people against the Spanish and against the Catholic-dominated patriarchy that lasted from like 1680 to like 1692. A lot of people call it the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, but there was actually several of them that took place. If you fast forward almost 200 years, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that was the treaty between the United States and Mexico shortly after Mexico took over this region, I guess I can say Southern California, Arizona, and New Mexico, from Spain in the 1820s. Interestingly enough, in the 1860s, it was my people that fed the troops that came from Iowa and Missouri when this country was taken over by the United States. And there were 4 treaties that we Zunis entered into, and we had thought that the United States in good faith had entered into as well. It turns out that none of those 4 treaties were ever submitted to the United States Senate, so they're literally one-sided treaties. In 1970, the Pueblo adopted a tribal constitution. And that tribal constitution is what governs the secular part of our government, and it's molded pretty mirror-like to the United States and the state of New Mexico constitutions. Of the 23 tribes in New Mexico, 4 pueblos have constitutions, and the rest of the tribes are governed by their customs and traditions, and they don't have an underlying constitution that they go by. This here is a picture that was taken in January of this year. It's not a great picture, but hopefully you can see the woman sitting with the blue flowered hoodie on, or the cape that she has on. And there's a man kneeling in front of her, and then there are 2 men in white clothes next to her. What they're doing in this picture, and I have permission from the Zuni Tribal Council to share this, all those individuals that are sitting facing us, they're newly elected tribal officials. And what they're doing in this ceremony here is they're receiving the canes. So in New Mexico, our pueblos carry canes. The first one was given to us by the king or viceroy of Spain. The second one was given to us by Abraham Lincoln. And then the third cane was given to us by a guy named Bruce King, who was the governor of New Mexico in the 1980s. And I say that kind of facetiously to sort of see the descending order of hierarchy. But we still carry those canes, and those canes are the real sources of power that come from our people in order for the tribal leadership to govern. And our tribal council, they're in for 4 years. They're elected, and I'm real happy to note there's of the 8-member tribal council, 4 are women this term. And so that's really nice to see. That didn't happen in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. It's really nice to see that the women are taking part and being elected to serve our people at the highest level. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm from. There's a map. There's the New Mexico-Arizona border. The nearest town is Gallup. It's right off the interstate of I-40. Our land is the biggest, next to the Navajo Nation, the biggest reservation in New Mexico. We have about 600,000 acres, and that's a location map there. So the title of my talk is How to Negotiate with Non-Tribal Entities, and I have a series of case studies that I'd love to share with you. The first one has to do with this place here. This place is known as Matlaketsiki, and there's a deity that lives there. I just mentioned her name, and what it is it's a salt lake. And it's a salt lake that all the tribes in the Southwest know about and that they've been coming to for decades and generations in order to mine the salt. You can just imagine what uses salt had, especially prior to refrigeration. In the 1980s, there was a company called the Salt River Project, and that Salt River Project proposed a coal mine within 5 miles of the lake. And I was actually working for tribal government at the time, like a lot of you who are land managers, people that are in realty. The tribe opposed that coal mine, and the way that the way this came about was that the cities of Phoenix, Las Vegas, Southern California, in the late 80s, they needed more power, and there's a generating station a few miles from here. In southwestern or southeastern Arizona, for which this coal mine was going to give fuel to. I think I'll go to the next slide. For those of you that are interested in that type of activism, that is community organizing around stopping coal mines and other things like that, I know that there's a lot of new news and a lot of new developments. The way we were able to get this coal mine to walk away, we used two strategies. The first one was just a stall technique. We lawyers are good at that. We entered into discussions with the company. We made NEPA difficult. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. And then we focused on hydrology. So the Pueblo Zuni hired its own hydrologist to point out that use of the water from the coal mine would impact that salt lake, and therefore would be against our interest. And then we also did something this I think is really interesting for those of you that are involved in these type of projects in your home communities. We actually went to the company's shareholders. We had a very robust public relations campaign, and we actually bought shares in the company in order to influence decision making there. And at the time, that was pretty novel. If you're a community fighting a proposed project by a company, the last thing you want to do is invest in that company, right? But that's exactly what Zuni did. We bought enough shares in the company in order to take part in shareholder meetings, and it was there that we were able to talk about our issue and about the Zuni Salt Lake, and we were actually able to get the decision makers to change their mind about siting that coal mine there. So instead of just sort of fighting it from the outside going in, that's one negotiation strategy that I have for you all today, is that if you actually buy shares in the company and try and influence the internal decision making of that company, you might have better success than trying to use outside regulations or public relation campaigns in order to effectuate change. Here's something. This has to do with something that's, I think, unique in New Mexico. I don't want to spend too much time talking about tax law. That's not a favorite afternoon topic, I'm sure. But for purpose of this illustration of this case study here, I state the following. Under federal law, certain transactions on a reservation can be taxed by both the tribe and the state. So if you have, I think there's a Mescalero Ski is the case that stands for this proposition, that if there's an activity going on the reservation, the tribe can tax that as sales tax. And if it's a certain type of transaction that's non-Indian to non-Indian, then the state can also tax it. So for those of you that are thinking about what the implications are of this, no industry or no business will locate on tribal lands because of the double taxation. So if a candy bar costs $1, right, but it's being taxed by the tribe, that's $1.08, and if it's also taxed by the state, then it's $1.16. That price makes it prohibitive to have a lot of candy bar sales on the reservation. What New Mexico did, and I don't know of any other state that has done this. I do know that in other states it's led to wars, litigation wars. I know that in law school we're taught about the tobacco wars or the cigarette wars in Washington state. Idaho also has those type. The state and the tribe fight over the taxing authority, and they go to court, they develop case law, someone wins, someone loses. In New Mexico, in the 1980s, the state and the tribes, they agreed on something. They actually decided to share the tax. So instead of there being two taxes on one transaction, there was one tax, and that tax was shared between the two entities. That's something that's really novel. I don't know any other state that does this, but for those of you that are in leadership positions in your tribe that deal with these type of issues, it's really nice to know that some states have decided that we're not going to fight with the tribes. We're going to actually share the tax. And in this situation, it actually works out to the benefit of the tribe, because the tribe gets 75% of those proceeds of the tax. The state gets 25%, and then the state is the entity that actually collects the tax, deals with all of the tax legal issues regarding protests and abatement, etc. And then they just process the fee for 2%, and they give the money to the tribes. We're in 2023 now, and there are more tribal members involved in state houses, state governments than there ever have been. So I would also ask that you individuals that work for tribes, if you have tribal members that work for state government as elected officials, it would be really nice to give them ideas like this, where the state can, instead of fighting with the tribes, the state can actually work with the tribes in order to effectuate something like a tax regime like this. This is something really good, and it's something that really benefits the communities, especially some of our poor reservations like mine in Zuni, where we don't have gaming, and we depend on tax revenue as a basis to supply basic services like police protection, firefighting, etc. So this is one thing that I offer to you as an example of a negotiation that went well. And it's something that every year, you have a new state legislature comes up, there's always individuals who don't know this history. Well, why are we sharing? And it always takes a level of lobbying them in order to get those individuals that are new to state government to realize that this is in the incentive of both the tribe and the state government. This one's an interesting one. I know cannabis is a really big issue in Indian country, as it is in state governments. More and more states are allowing cannabis to be used recreationally. That brings up issues of water rights, jurisdiction on land, permitting, etc. I know I deal with a lot of employment issues for tribal employees that have medical cards for marijuana and how the Indian tribe processes those. But I want to highlight here is an interesting situation that happened in the middle Rio Grande. So this is like between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, New Mexico, along the Rio Grande. There were 6 cannabis producers. They were within a few miles adjacent to an Indian reservation that I represent. When COVID hit, there was an Indian tribe next door, that's Cochiti Pueblo, and they closed its roads like a lot of our communities did when COVID happened. They closed the roads to non-Indians that were traveling through the reservation. And so you have these 6 producers of cannabis and nowhere to go. The only way that they could get from where they were growing their product to the freeway was right through the middle of a village that I represent. And this village is known as Santo Domingo Pueblo. For those of you that have ever heard of that village or have ever been there, they take their village very seriously. It's like the lifeblood of their community. They don't want to have major roads going through there. non-Indians are prohibited from going. So you have a situation created by COVID here where big trucks were coming through the heart of their village, and they're carrying cannabis, they're carrying cannabis products, they're carrying the workers that were going there. And what I want to, I guess, explain to you all as a matter of like what are lessons learned from this is that there's no rule book for something like this. In a situation where you have regulated cannabis off reservation that's legal, but where you have a community that doesn't want to have anything to do with cannabis, even the transportation of it, it's a really good time to have negotiations with the county government and also the state regulators that regulate it, so that a situation doesn't arise where a truck gets confiscated or something bad happens. This took some real delicate negotiation on my part in order to have those cannabis producers not use a public road because the tribe didn't want to give permission for that specific use for the road. And it may differ. I mean, Indian tribes are literally all over the place when it comes to regulation of cannabis. There are some that are actively for it. There are some that are actively opposed. And I think the majority of Indian tribes in this country are kind of just seeing how their state governments are doing. They're seeing the revenue coming in. They're also seeing some of the maybe the social situations that come in with cannabis. But that's an emerging thing. How does that relate to land? It relates to land in two ways. First of all, the state right to use cannabis recreationally or medically, that doesn't, just because you're an Indian tribe within that state, that doesn't mean that it's going to be legal within the specific tribal jurisdiction. Also, Indian tribes routinely get money from the federal government. I'd say that's a major source of revenue for the majority of tribes. One of the things that a tribal government signs whenever they get a 638 grant from BIA or Indian Health Service, or they get money from another federal agency, is they have a drug-free workplace promise. And so a lot of times individual tribes that want to move forward with cannabis regulation, they get stopped by the United States attorney because they realize that they signed this document to say that they're not going to have any drugs in the workplace. There's certain promises and strings that are attached with that. And a lot of times people don't put those two together until some legal issue rises and a crop gets confiscated or something bad happens because no one thought about the drug-free workplace requirement within the grant. Let's talk a little bit about fires. Fire has become a norm, especially for those Indian tribes that live up in the mountains. I think forest fires are becoming more prominent given global disruption in the weather. And this happened to me while I was working for an Indian tribe in New Mexico back in 2014. And so here's the situation. You had a tribe that contracted to thin U.S. Forest Service land. And so this is in the Manzano Mountains. For those of you that know New Mexico, they're south of the Sandia Mountains. They're part of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that come from Colorado through New Mexico along the Rio Grande. And in this particular situation, you have one tribal employee, and this tribal employee used a wood chipper, which caused a spark. And although that sounds like a very simple thing that happened, I'm going to show you what the effect of that was, if I can get this one to work. Charles, I may need your help with this.
Good afternoon. That fire continues to spread fast. It's gotten a lot of people's attention. It's pumping out so much smoke. People across the metro can see the plume. It's burning on the east side of the mountain and has a lot of people living nearby very concerned right now. News 13's Marissa Lucero is live near CLE with what's going on. Marissa?
Kim, details are very limited at this time, but I actually just want to step out of the way. Take a look behind me. The fire is going strong, and you can see closer to the ground that smoke is black. Now, Cibola National Forest officials are estimating the fire at least 70 acres. It was at only 8 acres at around 12:30 this afternoon. They have multiple crews working this fire, including one hotshot crew, 2 air tankers, and a helicopter dropping both retardant and water, plus crews on the ground. Now, we do know there is at least one hotshot crew already out there and more being called in. We understand this fire is burning near the 4th of July campground northwest of Tajique, and it's moving northeast toward the town of CLE.
Okay, so I think you all get the picture. By the time the fire was put out, there were 70,000 acres that were burned, and it all started with one spark, literally. I think Indian tribes more and more, when you're dealing with other jurisdictions that are neighbors, these situations will come up more and more. And the strong advice that I give to tribal communities is, first of all, and I know we have some insurance people here that introduced themselves early, get ready for just mails and a bunch of mail coming in from insurance companies on claims. I was getting about 50 letters a day from insurance companies right when the fire started. And there's subrogation agreements, there's all these, the notice of claim, there are all of these legal stuff that come up that if an Indian tribe isn't prepared for it, it could easily overwhelm the tribe. Just as far as, like in this situation, an entire town known as CLE burned. And so you have just catastrophic damage. And an Indian tribe really needs to hire good outside counsel or have their legal department really focus on this issue 24/7, at least for the first week, in order to handle the magnitude of claims that come through. Some other advice I give is that to develop a public relations campaign quickly, that is to get in front of the media about the cause. In this case, I've already explained that the probable cause of the fire was a tribal employee and tribal staff. It's really important to develop a public relations campaign right away to try and avert from the blame, because you just have a highly emotional situation where people are, rightfully so, they're upset if their house burned or they had damage to their property, etc. And then what I also advise tribes to do in these type of situations is to prohibit employees and officials from talking from media. I know that sounds kind of fierce, but that actually needs to happen in order to insulate the tribe from what's going to be a long legal battle. So this was about a year and a half. It didn't end up going to trial, but every statement that's made off the cuff when something like this happens can be used against the community later on when it comes to assessing blame and evaluating risk or managing it. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit. I have 4 or 5 different situations that I've encountered during my days of being an Indian lawyer, and I just put them up here. Hopefully you all can learn something from them, because I definitely learned a lot from them as I went through them. Some of you may be familiar with the Navajo-Hopi land dispute. It's also known as the Bennett Free Zone. What ended up happening, this is the total fault of the federal government. Sometime in the late 1800s, the Congress set aside some land on the Hopi reservation to create land for the Hopi people. And around that same time, the President of the United States set aside some land, the same parcel of land, for the Navajo Nation. And so you have 2 different federal branches of government setting aside the same piece of land for 2 different tribes. And if anyone knows anything about Hopi and Navajo, you'll know that there's a big dispute among them, even if you don't even consider this sort of land there, there's like rivalries and whole histories there. And so what ended up happening was Congress, in order to fix that Bennett refers to a senator who came up with this idea. They said, well, one of the tribes has got to move out. You just can't have them there. There was internal fighting, and it was just a bad situation all along. So what ended up happening was that parcel of land went to Hopi, and the Navajos were given a settlement. They were given a large amount of money with which they could purchase lands elsewhere. And so there's a rancher in Arizona. he actually he used to have a shoe store in Zuni. He spoke Zuni. He was a friend of my grandfather's. He had a lot of sheep in the Arizona area, and he wanted Zuni, a different tribe, right? So this isn't Hopi, this isn't Navajo. He really wanted Zuni to have that land. And so he approached Zuni. He went to tribal council, and Zuni had wanted to get this land back because it was part of our original claims. And there are a lot of older Zuni men who said, we're going to get that land back as part of our claims against the United States government. So when this rancher came to sell the land to Zuni, they refused him. And he went like a real Zuni would. He went 4 times. That's a very important thing in our culture to do. When you do something 4 times, it's like meant to be cemented and strong. And Zuni said, no, we're not going to buy this land from you. We had the money to do it, but we were sort of stuck on this idea that we're going to get this land back anyways, at the lawsuit against the federal government. Well, what he ended up doing when Zuni said no is the Navajo Nation that same year, they bought the whole ranch. And it was about like maybe 40,000 acres of land. And the advice I'm giving to you all today is something that I wish I had been stronger in when I was helping out Zuni on this, is that when you have a chance to buy land and you have the money, it's probably a good idea to purchase it. And I know that's general advice, but in this situation here, if you ask anyone who's on tribal council now about this deal that happened here, they wish they could have turned back time and purchased that land from the rancher while they had the chance. They didn't do so, and another tribe came in, and now so Zuni's kind of like being smushed in between the parcels of Navajo Nation land in Arizona. This one is more recent. This one I titled, Do Your Homework Before You Purchase. There's a 17-acre tract of land that's prime real estate, alfalfa. It's got irrigation, it's laser leveled. And the archdiocese approached one of my clients about this land, and they it was a priest that represented the archdiocese, and what he told the governor is that it's non-negotiable, and it's 17 acres for $1.5 million. If you do the math, that's really expensive. And so when the governor came to me as a new legal counsel, he said 2 things to me. He goes, it's $1.5 million, and we've got the money for it because it's in our Aboriginal land holdings. Well, it turns out that in retrospect, what should have happened, and the advice that I'm giving everyone here that are involved in these sort of outside non-governmental entities selling, is make sure to get an appraiser right away. There's two ways of doing this in real estate transactions. The first way to do it is you have your appraiser, the seller's appraiser, and the buyer's appraiser, and they both sort of come up with their appraised value, and they just cut that in half. Whatever that amount is in the middle, that's the fair market value for the property. There's another way to do it, and that is to have the seller's appraiser and the buyer's appraiser actually pick another appraiser and have that individual issue the fair market value for the property. My advice to clients when they're approached with these 2 types is to go for the first type if they can. Obviously, it's an agreement between the seller and the buyer. That has to be negotiated. But what fair market value is has to be done by professionals that are licensed appraisers, and one that you can rely on. A lot of times you'll get into real estate contracts where you have the brokers sort of being ahead of this. Sometimes I've been involved in a transaction where a brokerage firm was representing the buyer, and then a person who also worked for that firm was representing the seller. The advice that I give tribal communities is not to let the brokers be the head negotiators for you all, because sometimes brokers have interests. I think there's a big cliche that goes around that the real estate broker represents closing, and so that's really what they want because they get their commission that way. It's really important for the tribe to hire its own appraiser, someone that you trust, somebody that's been in the business for a while, in order to give you the exact fair market value for not just for the land, but also for the mineral estate. There's a lot of companies in New Mexico that sell land, and then there's water rights associated with it. And then what they do is they sever the water rights from the land and sell the land, and then they sell the water rights for a different price to another buyer. And so those kind of transactions can get complicated. The other piece of advice I give land managers when they're pursuing new land parcels is to make sure you get the surveyors and the actual people within the BIA that are going to look at this under a feeder trust application, that you get them in early. For this particular property, remember I told you all earlier that there's prior sovereigns in New Mexico? So before the land was in the United States, Mexico had it. Before Mexico, Spain had control over it. Well, because of that, the deeds and the surveys to a lot of these properties, they're in Spanish. They use meet and bounds and markers that aren't there anymore. Some are just tied to geographical features. There's a whole set of issues that come about when you're trying to perfect title or trying to get title insurance in order to convey a property, so that when you give it to the BIA in a feeder trust application, it has a bow on it and it looks pretty and nice, and it'll be processed efficiently. What I do in these type of transactions is I make sure that the real estate contract binds the seller to help the tribe in its feeder trust application if there's problems with the survey or if there's problems with the title. That's really important to do, because in a situation like this where you have, the first transaction is between the archdiocese and the tribe. And as soon as the tribe pays and it closes and title's given, the archdiocese has no, as the seller, they have no incentive to do anything else, right? Because they got paid, the transaction concluded, they walk away. But then when you go and take that title to a feeder trust application, which we're actually doing right now, even as we speak, and you run into issues with the title, you run into issues with the survey. Is it an ALTA survey? Is it not? Does it meet the U.S. Department of Justice standards? All of these questions come up, and it's much better to write in that previous real estate contract that the seller is still on the hook to assist the tribe in getting that application through. And usually you'll find that the sellers are willing to do that. You can escrow money aside as part of the transaction in order to effectuate it, etc. And then the final thing about this slide here, and that's really important, is that when you are purchasing land from a non-governmental entity that's outside the reservation, make sure to include and then thus deduct from the price all of the costs that the tribe's going to have in its feeder trust application. You can quantify that. Legal time is going to be like 20 hours. Staff time is going to be this much. You have to do an environmental site assessment. I was talking to an individual here yesterday who told me that he does these phase 1 ESAs for tribes, and that sometimes because transactions take longer than they should, he has to go in and update those ESAs every, I forget what he told me the intervening time is, because they get stale and you need to have them current. So build into the transaction all of those costs, including tribal council time, survey site time. Include that in the cost and try and get that deducted from the price, so that the seller knows that you're really not just purchasing this land, you're purchasing it with the idea of putting it into trust status later on, and you want to be covered throughout the entire length of that second transaction. Let's see if there's more here. This one, this is an interesting one. I titled this one, Not All Money is Green. This happened to me in 2010. There was a company by the name of Proximity. And what Proximity was trying to do is they were trying to get from Albuquerque to El Paso with a fiber route. Fiber is huge nowadays. I bet most of the people here probably, if you haven't just heard of, you're probably dealing with fiber optic on the reservation. That's a really hot topic now. This was in 2010, so it's kind of like a bit ago, right? 23 years ago. If any of you knows the Isleta Reservation, you have Albuquerque here, and you have El Paso down here. Isleta is like a giant rectangle, and it stretches out. It's very elongated this way. And on one side of it, you have the Manzano Mountains. Those are the ones that were part of the Doghead Fire as a border on this side. And then on this side, you have the Rio Puerco, which is a major waterway in New Mexico. And so any individual that's trying to get fiber from Albuquerque to El Paso, they have to go through Isleta because it's hard. It's cost prohibitive to go around it. And I remember we probably went through about 12, maybe 13 drafts of an agreement with proximity and the tribe, whereby the tribe would issue a consent to easement, right? That's the legal tribal council document that gives notice to BIA for them to grant an easement or a right-of-way to a company. And in exchange for that, the man that owned proximity, he wanted to give bandwidth to the tribe, a lot of bandwidth, enough fiber, lit fiber that would be able to run its casino, all its tribal offices, its police station. There's a little hospital there, a healthcare facility, and all of the tribal members who live there. And why do I bring this up as an example of negotiating? This was an example where there were 3 councilmen. I still talk to them today. I don't know how they think about me talking about them like this today. But they didn't understand the value of the bandwidth. And that's not a diss on them. That's just a very new thing. There's probably some of us in this room that can't quantify what that's worth. But it's really important as a negotiation technique to go back to the client and make sure that they understand that even though they're not getting dollar revenue from it, they are getting an economic benefit from that fiber. And if you talk to those 3 councilmen who voted against it, so I guess that's the conclusion of that deal there, is the guy went away. He ended up making his fiber route through the Manzanos, and that added about $800,000 to his project costs. I bet in these days it's probably in the millions. So he had to go around Isleta, and then Isleta never got any economic benefit from it. But if you talk to any of those 3 councilmen that voted against it because they thought they were getting shortchanged because there was no money being transacted, they all regret doing it. And they all wish that they had had somebody who they trusted, who could explain to them in real simple terms how much monetary value having fiber optic bandwidth is, and that they would have been fine with the deal. And I think I have a few more here. Oh, yes. I thought I would bring this up. I know there are some BI employees here. I couched this in very good terms. This is something that's happening in the Southwest region. And I can say this because I represent several Indian tribes there. There are projects that the BIA has yet to approve, and there are tribes that are waiting patiently for this to happen. And it's actually to the point now where some of the companies are pulling back. So I did a deal with a cell tower lease for an Indian tribe and Verizon back in July of last year. And that, approvals, everything got signed, negotiated, et cetera. But because it's a lease, it needs to be submitted to and approved by the BIA. The BIA has yet to approve that lease. And so Verizon is telling the tribe that they're going to pull out of the deal and go put their packet up, a couple miles down the road. I don't bring this up lightly. BIA is a federal agency. They're really short-staffed. I think they still have a work-from-home policy that is different than a lot of the tribes that after the pandemic subsided, going back to work. But I bring this up because this isn't just an issue for one of my clients. This is actually an issue for the entire region. And I'd be really interested to hear from others ways in which things could get better with regard to BIA approval. I was in the Hearth session earlier with some of you, and I mentioned this idea that the reason why the Hearth Act was put out there was so that the process would be sped up, but I don't think that has happened. It'd be interesting to query those 90 or so tribes who have Hearth Act jurisdiction to see if things are better. But this is something that I bring to everyone's attention. I think a lot of us already know there are issues with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and staffing, etc. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up as an issue, because the tribes in the Southwest region, they're in dire need of having their feeder trust applications approved, business land leases, cell tower agreements, road projects, etc. And they're just sort of not being able to at this time. This one I threw in here because a lot of individuals ask me all the time, why put things into trust? Why buy land and put it into trust status? And that's actually a really good point to bring up to leadership. It's not a given that if an Indian tribe buys a piece of land that they will put it into trust status. But I think a lot of individuals that are of that mindset, like we're not going to put this into trust status, they fail to realize that an Indian tribe owning a piece of property, and it's not in trust status, you can only assert ownership rights. You can't assert government rights on that parcel of land, and that's huge. Also, the idea of taxes. So a tribe purchases a piece of land. That piece of land is subject to ad valorem county taxes and zoning laws until such time as it's put into trust status. Those are the real big sort of reasons why tribes decide to put land into trust once they purchase it. But I had this situation come up with a tribal leader, and I'll never forget it, because this was a 100,000 acre ranch in Valencia County. The tribe bought it for about $8 million and had title to it. Decided they wanted to put it to trust status. We did the analysis, pros and cons, uses, projected revenue, core values, all of those things went into it. And at the very end, for those of you that haven't done a feeder trust application before, or for those of you that haven't been intimately involved in a transaction to put land into trust, the very last thing that the tribe has to do is they have to sign the warranty deed and give it to the federal government. It's an actual gift. Someone referred to it as a donative transfer. That's how we lawyers think about it. But it's actually, the title is given to the federal government, which makes sense because the definition of trust, a trust land, is that it's land that's owned in fee simple by the federal government, but it's held by the government in trust status for the benefit of that Indian tribe, or if it's an allotment for the benefit of that individual Indian. But that act of actually taking something that you've spent $8 million on and giving it to the federal government entirely through the title, that's something that most tribal leaders don't think about when deciding to do it, and it's just a hard thing to swallow for a lot of tribal leaders when they get to that point. So I always make it a point whenever having these discussions is to let the tribe know that at the very end of this, you're going to sign over title to that land to the federal government, and there's no take-backs. Like, it's not like we're giving this to you under these conditions. It's a warranty deed, and the federal government will own all of it in its entirety forever. There's no way that you can get it back once it's in trust status like that. And I think this is my last slide that I have here. This is more for financing. A lot of Indian tribes now are in the business of making businesses and growing businesses. And we've been fortunate enough, we being the Indian tribes in this country, that the CARES Act, there's actually two of them, CARES 1 and CARES 2, ARPA, Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, that's a more recent federal legislation. But there are set-asides in all of those laws for Indian tribes. And having done this for 20 years, these cycles come in waves where there's a lot of federal appropriations, things happen that cause this, and then you'll have a period of like 7 to 10 years where there aren't going to be much funding. So we're in a cycle where there's a lot of federal monies coming to Indian tribes for various purposes, and I'd recommend that all the tribes get as much as they can because I'm an advocate for tribes and because these pockets of money won't be here forever. Also for state governments, I think it's really important for people to realize where the state coffers get their money from. I come from a state in New Mexico where the majority of state revenue comes from oil and gas revenues. And so all you have to do is just follow the ebbs and flows, the canyons and the hills for economic development based on petroleum, and then you'll know how much of a surplus or how much of a default the state government is. And in New Mexico, we're in a surplus year. There's a lot of capital outlay monies, there's a lot of tribal infrastructure fund monies that are going to tribes, but again, those will not last forever. If some of you come from state governments that are more stable in their revenue and how money comes to the state, then you're not subject to those winds that we are in New Mexico. But as far as New Mexico is concerned, we're actually in a good couple years now. Also, there's this has become new. Tribes, for the longest time, they weren't realizing that they could borrow against future earnings for, like, let's say you have a gas station or you collect gross receipts tax. There's a lot of innovative financing that I've been involved in where a tribe can use its future revenue in order to get a loan in order to do some community service project. That's actually becoming more and more of a revenue stream than there was before. And banks, more often than not, are willing to use that type of collateral, especially if you've been vending that for a good amount of time. So it's not a new revenue stream, it's one that's stable and one that you can project into the future that's going to provide revenue to the tribe. Borrowing from investments, that's also big. I don't know how many of you follow the stock market and the interest rate. Last year and the year before that, the interest rates were really low. And so what's good about these type of deals here is that when an Indian tribe borrows against its investment, it's just borrowing money that it already has invested. So you're not borrowing from an outside source. Any interest that is paid on that loan goes back to the tribe. And so tribes all around the nation have found that as a really good revenue stream for one-time projects, either to purchase land or to staff up an office or some other community project. And then there are these things, the new market tax credits. I don't know, I won't get into those in detail, but if anyone wants information about it, in New Mexico, I've been able to build 5 comprehensive health centers, a school, and then we're building a child care center based on this type of tax deal. It's basically where you get outside investors that they recoup their money based on a 7-year federal income tax deduction that they get. And so it's a little bit tricky to finance these for Indian tribes, but we found a way to do it. And those projects that I just described, they're like super helpful to the community, and we were able to do that using the new market tax credit. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. You all have a good afternoon. Okay? Thank you.